I want to talk about a belief today that sits at the heart of Christianity, which, at the risk of sounding dramatic, I really do believe is one of the most psychologically harmful ideas ever conceived by Christianity, and one of the most difficult beliefs to deconstruct when you leave Christianity. And that is the idea that people actually reject God. Now, while this belief is, of course, very damaging psychologically, it's also honestly quite hilarious to think about. And we're going to pull out some of these fallacies today. But this is the claim that Christians will make, is that everyone who doesn't convert to Christianity is therefore rejecting God and therefore deserves hell. I've heard this trope countless times from Christian pastors and evangelists and apologists, and you probably have too. Because whenever you sort of press a Christian on the immorality and logical fallacy of saying that God is love but also tortures people in hell, this is how the sort of Christian mind squares that circle, is they'll almost always reply, well, brother, you can't force anyone to choose God, right? God gave us free will. And so if somebody rejects God, they're simply choosing to be separate from God forever. It's their choice. Now, sometimes you'll even get the shorter response, which is, God doesn't send people to hell. People choose to go to hell of their own free will. Now, even as a Christian, I would cringe and laugh hard inside when people would say this, because it's an absolutely absurd claim to make, that people choose hell and reject God. How can you not see what a bad argument that is? How exactly do you imagine this happening, right? Do you think that there's some sort of long queue line in front of the gates of hell, and people are just sort of lined up like they're at Disneyland, just waiting for the next ride to swan dive into the lake of fire? I choose hell! Splash! How do we exactly picture this choice really playing out? Now, I really don't know what idea is crazier, that people can reject God, which is reality itself, or that people actually choose hell. In a sense, they're identically absurd claims to make, and they're both made at the same time by the apologist. And so to me, this is an idea so bizarre and so backwards that I can't help but laugh at the sheer absurdity and audacity of it. I remember just how many people in Christianity really do live in a kind of silent terror of this doctrine. And as somebody who has a platform, I hear from thousands of current and former Christians every year in my comments and emails and DMs who have been almost irreversibly traumatized by this belief. Because such an existential threat doesn't just dominate your theology, it hijacks your entire nervous system to believe that if you reject God, whatever that turns out to be, you're going to spend eternity in hell. And even if you go to heaven, probably many of the people you know and love, your friends and your family, will have chosen hell and wind up being tortured forever. And could you be happy in heaven knowing that your mom's being barbecued in hell? I sure couldn't. So it turns out that the idea of God as a loving creator does not square well with this concept of eternal conscious torment. And so there has to be a kind of justification for how a loving God also tortures people, billions of people, forever, and never forgives them. Love me or I'll torture you is not exactly a great axiom to run a religion on, right? Because that's not love, and nobody would ascribe to such a God that would say such a thing. But that, nonetheless, is the God at the heart of Christianity. And so to put someone under threat or duress in order to get them to make a choice of any kind is not love. Love doesn't put a gun to somebody's temple and tell them to confess and believe or I'll blow your brains out. It turns the idea of God as a loving creator into a kind of cosmic dictator who dangles people over the lake of fire and says, confess my son or I'll torture you forever. And obviously that's not love. That's a hostage negotiation. Love doesn't threaten. Love saves, love heals, and restores. It'd be like having an uncle, and you have a friend come over and you're like, hey, meet my Uncle Stan. And they're like, hi, Uncle Stan. And Stan seems like a really nice guy, super kind, opens the door for you. And you say, wow, man, your Uncle Stan is sure a nice guy. And you're like, yeah, he's the best, man. So kind, so benevolent. And he's like, but when it gets to be around lunchtime and those hunger pangs kick in, he does kind of shift into a sort of monster, if you can imagine it. And you're like, wait, what do you mean? You're like, well, when he gets hungry, he gets real angry. And he will beat the crap out of you if you're in the room with him when he gets hungry. Okay, now does anybody care that Stan is nice when he's not hungry? Does it matter that Stan's a great guy outside of his manic lunchtime episodes of bludgeoning people? Of course not. None of that matters at all, because the definition of kindness is that you are someone who never gets into moods where you go assault people and harm people, right? It doesn't matter if you're kind 23 hours of the day and murderous 1 hour of the day. You're going to prison and nobody wants to see you in public anymore. So why do we think that it's justifiable to say, yes, God is love, but God's, also just, and so he must torture people forever. But don't worry, he's still loving. It's good news. I don't want to spend eternity in heaven with a God like that, and I bet you probably don't either. So in today's video, I want to deconstruct the common Christian idea that people actually reject God in some final or absolute way, and show you that this idea actually presupposes all sorts of impossible things that you have to first justify before you get to claim that people can reject God and choose hell. But most of all, I hope that this video will serve as a kind of breath of fresh air to anybody still suffocating from this religious propaganda. Because yes, this idea is very funny and silly to joke about on the other side of deconstruction, but I remember full well just how terrifying and difficult it was to release these lifelong beliefs I had held, that people who aren't Christian are rejecting God and therefore deserve hell. And so it is a very terrible idea to live with, and one that deeply warps your perception of other people and causes all kinds of judgments to form in your mind about people who aren't part of your religion. And that is very antithetical to the Jesus way, as Yeshua taught us not to judge our neighbor, but to forgive them 70 times 7 and to love them as ourself. And like myself, most Christians never realize this important point until after they leave Christianity. But this is such an unbearable psychological burden to live with. To believe that at least 75% of everybody you see and meet and love and interact with in life are going to be heinously tortured for all of eternity with no hope of redemption. This is an idea so dark and demonic and twisted that it will warp the universe into this kind of weird cosmic Saw movie that we're all stuck in. And we're just glad to be the one that doesn't have to go into the dark room when it's all over. Nobody wants to think of reality like this. And so it makes perfect sense that the overwhelming majority of fallacies and blatant contradictions in the Christian religion lie at the center of this belief, that this belief of people rejecting God and choosing hell is so screwy and loopy and contradictory that it really does take some serious philosophical unpacking to appreciate the absurdity of these arguments. And those of us who grew up in religion are well aware of how damaging this idea can be, because most of us were taught this idea when we were far too young to know any better. But now we do know better. So let's get into it. I'm Aaron Abke, and this is Moving Backwards, episode 30. So let's begin with a philosophical inquiry into the Christian claim. God must send people to hell if they reject him, because God must respect human free will. Now there's 4 pretty extreme presuppositions in this claim, if you noticed. First, that God must ... Really? you know what God must do in certain situations. If somebody arrives at the afterlife and they have or haven't confessed, God must do XYZ to that person, and you know that for sure. That's an interesting claim. I'd love to see the justification for that. Second, the presupposition that hell is the only alternative. That's an interesting presupposition. The only alternative to choosing Christianity is the worst imaginable alternative. There is no better possible alternative other than that. And you know that for sure. For example, God could conjure up all kinds of long and painful paths toward redemption, where every soul who has not made it into heaven has to receive twofold or maybe even threefold all of the evil and harm they'd ever done to others. But eventually, after enough agonizing suffering in the afterlife, just repeatedly experiencing all the evils they did to others, finally, their sins will be atoned for and they can be forgiven and allowed into heaven. Why isn't that a logical possibility in the Christian paradigm? Why is it always asserted that only the worst imaginable possibility is the alternative to being a Christian? God would never give a soul a long, painful path of redemption or reconciliation with God. No, we know for sure God tortures those people forever. There's a lot of question begging here, to be sure. And that leads us to the third presupposition, which is the idea that it is actually possible to reject God. And that's a walloper of a presupposition, which we're going to unpack further in today's video. And then finally, our fourth presupposition is that, again, God must respect free will, even when it comes to matters of eternal damnation. So the idea is, even though God knows that this person is going down the wrong path, they're hanging out with the wrong crowd, doing drugs, all kinds of stuff, and if they don't repent and confess Jesus before they die, they're going to burn in hell forever. But God can't intervene. You know, if they want to go down that road, He's got to let them, and they're going to walk right into hell without realizing it, but God must respect their free will. It can't intervene to wake them up. How does this idea hold up to scrutiny? Does a loving parent always honor their little child's free will, even if they're about to crawl off of a cliff or into oncoming traffic? Or does the parent gladly and willingly violate their child's free will out of love for the child, knowing that the child is simply too young and naive to perceive its own best interest? Do we really think God doesn't look at us, compared to God's level of intelligence, of course, like we're all a bunch of children who don't know anything, who can't perceive our own best interest, and we think the drugs and the sex and the rock and roll is going to satisfy us, and so we just keep walking into the street? And don't you think God understands that we can't perceive our own best interest and wants to help us wake up to those choices? So if this is a universally celebrated quality in human parents, are we absolutely sure that God would never do the same for His children? Are we positively certain that God never intervenes in human affairs when our free will is getting us into trouble? I mean, the entire Hebrew Bible is loaded with stories of God intervening in human affairs and human free will, even commanding humans against their free will to do things they don't want to do and to not do things that they do want to do. So are we really so sure when it comes to matters of eternal damnation that God is unwilling to help someone see the error of their ways and forgive their mistakes? Nope. He's got to honor their free will, says Christianity. To hell with you. You chose it. I'm not so sure. I mean, how does it make any sense to say that, oh yeah, in the Bible, God intervenes in human free will all the time and forgives people when they're going astray. But when it comes to matters of people's eternal salvation, He never steps in to intervene. He never wakes people up at the last moment. He never forgives or shows people their mistakes. He only does that in the Bible. Everyone else is SOL. Are we really supposed to believe that an omniscient God, an all-knowing creator, really thinks that everyone who's not a Christian is rejecting him? A God who can read every thought in every mind and knows exactly the motives of every person thinks that everyone who doesn't pray the Nicene Creed has rejected God? And when someone claims that somebody can reject God, what are they presupposing there? Well, they're clearly presupposing that it's possible to reject God, that it's possible for a person to have the correct and accurate understanding of what God is. Because obviously, you can't reject something you don't understand. It's an impossibility. You can only reject your own flawed understanding of it. And so if someone rejects math because they don't understand math, does math take a hit? Does math cease to exist? No, because math is a transcendent reality which is unaffected by the thoughts of humans. How much more transcendent and unaffected would God be then? And likewise, if someone rejecting a flawed or distorted view of God has no effect on God whatsoever, then why does God need to torture them again? God would have no need to punish such a person for their thoughts. And so I'm going to give you my 4 biggest arguments against this common Christian claim that non-Christian people are rejecting God. Argument number 1, you cannot reject what you don't understand. If somebody rejects a hypocritical or contradictory or fallacious view of God, they're right for doing so. It is good to reject what is not true, but a Christian will accuse such a person of literally rejecting God. But what should be extremely obvious to all of us by now is that our thoughts about reality are by no means the same thing as reality itself. So whether you understand or don't understand something, reality goes on unaffected by your thoughts about it. It simply isn't possible to understand God with the mind. And so if someone mentally rejects any idea of God, they've still not rejected God in reality, because God is not an idea. God is not a belief in your brain. It's simply not possible to reject something you've never actually encountered or understood. Think about it this way. If somebody says, calculus is stupid and useless, but they can't even solve a basic algebra equation, do you take their opinion of calculus seriously? Do you think that their argument has damaged or hurt calculus in any way? Has calculus been changed by their opinion? No, because you have common sense, and so you easily recognize that they're not actually rejecting calculus itself. They're rejecting their own idea and frustrations with calculus. You can't reject something you don't understand. Well, this is exactly what happens with God, but much more so. People are not rejecting God as the source of their own being and the source of all love and consciousness and life in the universe because they don't understand God to be that. They're rejecting a limited, fragile idea about God that they've been presented by religion. They're rejecting a concept that they were taught, not God itself. And usually people are taught these concepts as children, wrapped in fear and punishment and guilt and control. And so people are rejecting the sort of angry sky daddy that Christianity sells them. The one who sends people to hell for even one mistake, one sin, and I'll send you to hell forever, unless you admit that you're a worthless sinner and confess my son's ritual blood sacrifice. Then I'll forgive you. I mean, hello? This is an evil, satanic, and reprehensible view of the Creator, and people are right to reject it. One of my best friends growing up in church was named Ryan, and Ryan ended up leaving our church and Christianity at 17 years old. And so when I would confront Ryan about this when we would hang out, I would try to convert him back to Christianity, and his pushback was always that he just couldn't believe that a loving God would send people to hell forever. He said, I still believe in God, I just don't believe in a God that tortures people. And when I would go back to church and talk to my youth leaders and hear other people talking about Ryan's backsliding, they would always say things like, well, the poor young man's just walking down the path to hell and doesn't realize it. It's like, okay, wait a minute. Just because somebody rejects the idea that a loving God could also torture people, that they've rejected God itself and are going to be tortured in hell forever. I don't think so. I think that they've just rejected a cartoonish, sophomoric, illogical, and indefensible concept about God. See, there's a big difference. There's a big difference between rejecting an idea about something and the thing itself in reality. How do you reject reality? What is real already exists. What is real cannot be threatened. And so therefore, it cannot be rejected. So the only thing that is possible to reject are mental ideas. But reality is beyond the mind. And this is ultimately why the vast majority of Christians who leave Christianity choose to do so. They've either had really bad experiences in church and Christian culture, or they had abusive Christian parents or pastors growing up, or even more unfortunately, it's not that uncommon that children and young adults in both Catholicism and Christianity experience sexual abuse or manipulation or psychological control by their pastors and youth group leaders. I saw a lot of it growing up in Christendom and even experienced some of it myself. So these Christians naturally get burnt out and traumatized and wind up leaving. And then all their Christian friends sort of shrug their shoulders and say, "What a shame, they've rejected God." Maybe. Or they're just tired of the contradictions and the hypocrisy. So they're going to look for God outside of your religious structure, which has failed them. Maybe that's also equally possible. So whether we're talking about an atheist or an agnostic or a former Christian who's turned to Eastern spiritual philosophy, such people are always talked about as heretics and judged as being morally bad people who have rejected God in some final sense. But it should be obvious that if someone does say, "I reject the Christian God," what they're really saying is, "I reject the version of God that condemns people to hell, who commands the genocide of women and children, who's jealous and petty and violent and tribal and irrational. And guess what? I reject that God too. And so should you. And so should anyone who believes in the God revealed by Jesus. So if that's your image of God, I say yes, let it burn, baby. Because that's not who God is. That's a human projection, and you are right to reject it. But this still sort of begs the question, doesn't it? How can someone reject God if they're incapable of understanding God? Everyone agrees that the human mind can never understand the totality of God. Even Christians. Christians will say, well, of course you can't actually understand God. God is beyond all comprehension. To which I agree. The human mind cannot understand God. But if you believe that God is beyond human comprehension, then how can you also say that people can reject God, whom they do not understand? Either you can understand God, and therefore it's possible to reject God, or you can't understand God, and therefore it's not possible to reject Him. But both cannot be true. If someone were to stand in the unveiled presence of God's divine love, the source of all their being and consciousness and the power that beats their heart and breathes their lungs, could they really reject that? What would that even look like? You're saying you don't want to be loved and supported and animated with life? Could someone really say that to God? No thanks, God. You can keep your love and happiness and consciousness. I'd rather burn in hell. Would someone? Could someone ever really make that choice? Could someone make that choice having full knowledge of the choice they're making? To even claim that someone could stand before God and not desire God or reject God is to claim that God is not ultimately fulfilling. It is to claim that God is not the ultimate purpose of every human existence, and so that if a person were standing before God, they would not immediately realize this, even if they were living in sin and delusion. That's a difficult claim to justify. And this leads us to our next point. Argument number 2. It is everyone's free will to be happy and not suffer. And this one should be obvious, right? Nobody, literally no one, wants to suffer and not be happy. Every human being on the planet, even the worst criminals and the most abusive people, are doing what they do because at some level, they believe it will bring them relief, or pleasure, or power, or peace inside. Are they misguided? Absolutely. But human motives are always rooted in the same things. Everyone wants to be happy and not suffer. And so if God is the source of all happiness, and hell is the epitome of all suffering, how could someone really choose hell? Surely if these God rejectors knew that they were really choosing eternal conscious torment, well, they would gladly jump to the front row of the heavenly church choir and sing praises to God for eternity, wouldn't they? Wouldn't you? When anyone truly believes that they might even potentially be facing eternal conscious torment as a possibility, they are quick to take whatever solution that they're offered, and they're not wrong for doing that. Eternal conscious torment is a completely unjustifiable punishment that no one ever could deserve. It's impossible. And so how can you say that someone is choosing that when that would literally be the last choice they would ever freely make? How can you say that people are rejecting God if God is the source of all joy, peace, and love? So again, which one is it? Is God the source of all love and joy and peace and happiness, and therefore nobody could or would ever reject that? Or God isn't the source of all that, and so people can reject God. You don't get to have it both ways. Now, to this point, a Christian might say, well, yes, those people are looking for happiness, but they're looking for it in all the wrong places. And okay, I agree, but that just reinforces the point all the more, doesn't it? They're not rejecting God. They're looking for happiness. They're just confused about where happiness is. They're not rejecting God. They're just mistaking substitutes for God. They don't know that God is the source of all happiness. So they think it's in the money, the sex, the status, the fame, the pleasure. They're trying to fill a God-shaped hole in their heart. Such people need to be loved and helped, not judged and cast into hell in our minds. Such people need to be guided back to the light. But by sinning, no one is rejecting God. Sin is the ignorance of God, not the rejection of God. Even when I was growing up Christian, I used to think to myself, when are we going to stop pretending that people rejecting a religion is the same thing as them rejecting God? People are not rejecting God, they're rejecting bad theology. And I had many problems with it myself, even as a Christian. People are rejecting hypocrisy and fear-based control and psychological trauma wrapped up in the guise of Scripture. And this leads us to our next point. Argument number 3. The only real way to accept God is through how you live. So let's just get practical for a moment. Anyone can say, I believe in God. Belief is easy and words are cheap, but it's how you live that's the real test of your faith. Do you really follow the commandments of Jesus, or just the ones that you like? Yeshua's salvation teachings are continually glossed over and ignored on Sunday mornings, always in favor of the same old boring Paul messages about being saved by grace through faith alone, apart from works. But this was not Jesus' message. That was Paul's message. Jesus never told anyone that they would be saved by grace through faith alone. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. And you are my disciples if you do what I command you. So if someone lives a life of love, generosity, service, and humility, but they don't identify as a Christian, are we really expected to believe that God would torture that person for eternity? Let's be honest. If your theology makes Gandhi burn in hell forever, while Jeffrey Dahmer goes to heaven because of a deathbed confession, maybe it's time for you to question your belief system about the afterlife. The important part is, actions reveal the heart, and God always sees the heart behind our actions. Nothing is hidden from God. And this brings us to our final point. Argument number 4. Fear-based choices are not true choices. And this is a big one. Christians will say, well, God doesn't force you to accept Him. You have to choose Him of your own free will. But let's be honest, when you're told that not choosing God leads to eternal conscious torment, is that really a free will choice anymore? Now the line between conversion and coercion has grown very thin. Because if we can be real for a second, when anyone is faced with the possibility of eternal torment, I would literally do any other possible option than that. I would confess and believe whatever somebody wants, if I really thought that that was a fate that I was possibly facing. But again, does a fear-based decision make faith real and genuine? Because you're afraid of something, so you run to something else? Is that real faith? Does that please God? Imagine this scenario. Someone puts a gun to your head and says, "Marry me or I'll shoot you and blow your brains out." And when you protest that this is unfair, they say, no, I'm giving you free choice. I'm not forcing you to marry me. You're allowed to choose. But if you say, no, I will blow your brains out, your choice. That's not free will, is it? That's called blackmail. That's spiritual extortion, not conversion. Such a Christianity is no love story, but a hostage crisis. You're told to freely choose God while you're being dangled over a pit of infinite suffering, and that's supposed to be a love story written by God? Obviously, anyone in that position would choose God instead of that. And so, what kind of God demands love under threat of torture? If eternal torment is the consequence for not choosing God, then God cannot be a free will choice. If it's choose love or be tortured, love cannot be chosen as an authentic free will choice. In such a universe, we're all just hostages to the love of God. Because if we don't let God love us, then He will torture us. What a sick relationship to have with your Creator. What kind of God needs fear to earn loyalty? Not the God that Jesus revealed, I can tell you that. So from this analysis, it should be clear that the common Christian trope that people who reject Christianity are really rejecting God is an unjustifiable claim from start to finish. It has no real ground to stand on because you cannot reject what you cannot understand. You cannot choose freely under threat and duress, and you can't be judged eternally for misunderstanding something that no human mind is capable of understanding. And you can only truly accept God, aka not reject God, by obeying God, by living a life of devotion to God. Anything else is just empty lip service and blind platitudes. People are right to reject wrong ideas about God. People reject ideas of God which are proven to be harmful and fear-based and manipulative. And so they reject religious anxiety. They reject depression. They reject the self-hatred and the spiritual trauma that they're given in church. And so to anyone watching this who's been told that they're going to go to hell for leaving Christianity, you can rest at ease, my friend, that this is just religious, fear-based propaganda. It's the cult trying to suck you back in with fear and manipulation. But rest assured, as you know in your heart, you can't reject God, and you haven't. you've rejected a man-made religious depiction of God. And that is not a sin, it is sanity. You, my friend, are forever in God, and God is forever in you, as Jesus taught. You are always the beloved, even when you wander away from the warmth of your Father's love. God will allow you to wander, absolutely, and suffer and suffer and suffer as long as you wish. But God always plans a path of redemption and a return back home again, into the heart of God from whence you came. God is the air you breathe. God is the consciousness by which you exist. And nothing, not your doubt, not your questions or your past or your guilt, nothing can separate you from God's love. So we can be thankful to religion for instilling these incredibly warped ideas about God into our minds, because in doing so, they have forced us to reject them and search ever deeper within to find the truth of who God is. And it's only when someone turns within to look for God that they actually find God. So, in summary, always remember that you cannot reject the truth. You can only forget it. And that is why God wrote it on your heart.